The Book of Learning and Forgetting by Frank Smith. This book looks at two views of learning. The first of these views is what is known as the classic view of learning, and the other one is known as the official theory. We will start off with summarizing the first classic view of learning. The classic view of learning takes the approach that we learn from the interactions that we encounter each day. In other words, we learn from those around us with those that we identify with and how we identify ourselves as well. The best example that is provided in the book is how we acquire language. Language is often the key to learning. We begin to do this at a very young age, and we continue to do so all through life. In fact, language is best, according to the author of the book, acquired through the written text, something that is promoted throughout the book by Mr. Smith. Also, this is important to note that one of the main points that is made in this portion of the classic view of learning is how, as we acquire language and as how we interact with the world around us, what is happening is we're taking the lessons and the knowledge that we are learning and moving them to what is known as the short-term memory into long-term memory. He describes in detail how one has to move what we encounter each day, something as simple as a phone number, and we apply it to, say, our long-term memory. This is one of the important steps of the classic view of learning. It can best be done in a learning environment if students, as written by the author, are able to relate to what they're acquiring. In other words, if what they're learning, whether in a classroom setting or whether something that's taking place around them in a book, he actually goes in details if the student or if the individual can relate to what the author is writing, then they're more apt to learn something from the book that they're reading, as opposed if, say, we give a child a textbook and require them to read a few lines or a few pages from the book. But if there's nothing in the textbook or what is written, if there's nothing they can relate to, then often, as the author describes, that more or less stays in what we know as the short-term memory and goes and fails to go into the long-term memory, which in his sense is what we call true learning. Also, as we transition to the next portion of the book, the author describes in detail about how the one-room schoolhouse was a classic example of this type of learning. In such an environment, you had a range of learning abilities, a range of ages, a learning of individuals around you. But in that sense, students were able to thrive and learn. Next, we'll move on to the other vision of learning that was written in the second chapter of the book. The next portion of the book focuses on what is called the official theory of learning. This is a theory of learning that, as the author describes, has its roots in the advancement or modernization of the Prussian army that began in the mid to late 19th century. Wanting to be successful on the battlefield, the Prussian army began to use a method of standardization, began to organize its units, began to organize its training in a much more standard way that was replicated throughout the entire ranks. And given the success that they had on the battlefield at the time, particularly in the Franco-Prussian War, other aspects of society began to look at it as a way in which they too could become successful. This is also the time that many industries were becoming using standardization to modernize. That carried on into World War I, when the United States Army also too had to rapidly prepare for war. It also adopted standardization, particularly through testing. I think that was mentioned a good deal in the book about how in order to organize who was better prepared to be officers or to serve in certain units, this was when testing came to being. Speaking of testing, it's also a time when the field of psychology itself, as described in the book, wanting to become considered a legitimate player, if you will, in academia. At the time, they were viewed much like the field of education was viewed as an art form. Wanting to become viewed more as a scientific endeavor, the field of psychology began to adopt some of the standardization, some of the means of measuring in what they were doing, particularly in their experiments. And as we transitioned into, ironically enough, another war, World War II, another phase of this official theory began to take hold of learning, and would later be applied to the field of education. And that view was the role of logistics. The huge logistical operation that would become known as D-Day, and the success that was gained in the year following D-Day with the defeat of Germany. Many people in academia begin to look at that as a way in which success could possibly be translated into the classroom. Again, much of the individuals who were part of D-Day, some of which, particularly the logistical planning operation, were also the same individuals that looked at America's challenges in the Cold War, one of which was getting a man on the moon during this time. And part of what was adopted in that endeavor, much like D-Day, was this idea of standardization, this way of everything being kind of planned out, logistically planned out. It also changed the way we view the classroom setting. I think it was during this time that the author talked about how Sputnik had changed the way in which many in the field of education felt about education. In other words, for those who held on to the classic view of learning, it pretty much was washed away in the 60s as Sputnik kind of frightened us to become more focused on how we teach kids and how they should learn. Or in other words, at the time, how do we solve problems? One of the ways in which all this kind of meshed together was going back even to World War One, and even by psychology, was how we measure this. In other words, how do we measure what success on the battlefield is? How do we measure the steps that we take to get to the moon? We took all of these ideas that we had to measure all along the way and apply that to what we were doing in the classroom. In other words, the way in which schools were viewed under this is really when the official theory began to take hold, was that the only way we could determine success in the classroom was through what became known as standardized testing, or standardized assessments. I think the author mentioned that since the 1920s, there had been well over almost 200 types of standardized tests given out through the United States. And unfortunately, we've only rid of ourselves of maybe 30 of those, give or take a number or two. But so this is kind of where America progressed, even on into the information age. In fact, in some sense, as the author describes, it really intensified with the age of the internet, the age of computers. Again, I think the whole thinking behind the official theory was that if we were successful in all of these endeavors throughout the 20th century, getting a man on the moon, winning World War II, that everything that we were doing had to be correct and applied to the classroom. And it more or less justified the supporters of the official theory as to what they were doing educationally. The last segment of the book examines how do we transition back? How do we, in his sense, repair the damage that was brought about with the onset of the official theory of learning that was prevalent throughout the 20th century. The first way in which the author goes into details and describes how we move beyond that, is that we've got to stop looking at kids as just individuals and students as individuals whose main primary responsibility is to memorize facts and then hope they can remember those facts in order to be successful on a test. I think the cartoon there illustrates what we've progressed to, or shall we say, what we've moved to since we've adopted the official theory of learning in our education system. And the author describes that the key to that transition of, shall he say, repairing the damage is the teacher, not the teacher standing in front of a classroom, doing what we would often call in our field of study, sitting and getting or providing information. In other words, kids just sitting in their seats and writing notes. It requires teachers to engage, to get students to tap into the world around them, to find what they're learning to be relevant. In fact, the author lists 3 steps, and the first of those steps, or actually the third of those steps, is that the teacher should always be honest. You know, let them know as they begin to transition that um, it's a tough road. Part of the challenge is that the world around them, particularly in what they've come to learn in education, still applies under the official theory, and that they're working to move beyond that. In fact, it requires that, as the author describes, a willingness to step out there, a willingness on the behalf of that teacher, as well as leaders in the school environment, to break the norms, because, as he describes it, it will be one of the larger challenges for individuals in education, but it's one he felt that is uh, really needed. 5 major points that the author, that I believe were in the book. The first of which is learning is constant. It's influenced by our immediate environment. I thought this picture, this saying by famous Hollywood actor, martial arts expert Bruce Lee, life itself is your teacher, and you are in a state of constant learning. I felt that was what the author felt the classic view was all about, as well as the next major point is that learning that is relevant and not forced tends to lead to lasting and insightful knowledge. In other words, as the illustration depicts, is that once students or individuals find what they're learning or what interests them to be relevant, then that's when knowledge is gained. The next point uh, is, as we moved into the official theory portion of the book, an individual, I felt that the point of that segment was an individual quickly unlearns something if the process for learning is delivered in the same manner that we prepare for battle and success on the launch pad. In other words, um, as the cartoon indicates, you can't take a square peg and place it in a round hole, and that all the successes of the 20th century, building the modern industrial age, winning wars, getting to the moon, doesn't necessarily mean that's how we translate success in the classroom. Um, in fact, my next point is that I think the author pretty much states that the art of learning was hijacked by both the industrial and information age. That we became so standardized, we became so in a sense, fragmented on how we should teach kids. And lastly, I think in the final segment of repairing the damage, I think the major point there was that the key to the change, the key to repairing the damage will be the teacher, the instructor. Again, that teacher can take the role of someone in the classroom, or that parent. He discusses in detail about the role of the parent in that final segment. And I thought this quote by Albert Einstein summed it up quite well. It is the supreme art of the teacher to awaken joy in creative expression and knowledge. And I felt that quote really touched upon what I think the author was trying to convey in his message about the classic view of learning being the correct uh, way in which education should transpire to. Quotes from the book. The first quote that I found to be pretty relevant to the world in which I work in, which is in education, states that, and there has certainly been no evidence that testing has made schools better. In fact, the constant argument of people who want more testing is that the quality of education is declining. That seems to be fairly true, particularly in the last 15 and 20 years, where now everything about the school, whether it's from the entire district, the state, down to the classroom, can only be summarized as being successful if we as a group or as a student demonstrate some success on a test, and that the individuals who want to portray a school as not being successful decide that the only way in which we can determine that is if we begin to test more. That's pretty true today. The next quote, but computers have no intelligence. They have information, but no insight, uh, memory, but no judgment. Um, Again, as someone who's been in education for 20 years, who actually right now in my current job as a director of instructional technology, I understand the useful tool that computers have become in learning. However, um, one must always remember that at the end of the day, it's individuals who have insight on someone's learning and the world around them and can be able to make good judgments about student learning and about how one uh, can learn. The next quote, if we don't trust ourselves to learn, then we apply the official theory to ourselves with disastrous results. But if we identify with successful learners, then we have the best hope for becoming more efficient members of the learning club ourselves. Um, I thought this really spoke to how, as I've seen students over the years, how they've gained confidence. Once they gain confidence, particularly if the confidence comes from surrounding themselves with people who are successful, uh, they begin to move on. If they don't, what you see is that we are, as the author describes here, it seems to me that if we don't have that confidence in our own abilities to learn, that we will accept whatever mechanism there is to learning, whether it's memorizing facts in a book. Uh, the next two quotes, teachers shouldn't expect people outside the classroom to improve their working conditions for them. All the problems were created by people outside the classroom. Teachers must take charge of their own professional lives. The author in the last segment of the book really focuses on the important role that the teachers have, and that in changing the way in which education has transpired over the years. In fact, this last quote I thought was kind of to that point. Teachers may be so busy concentrating on what students fail to learn from a ritualistic classroom activities that they ignore what students are learning from their educational experience as a whole. I think this kind of summarized what the author was trying to point out with the classic view, is that uh, students are always learning. They may not be learning what is put before them, but in that environment, they're learning something, particularly from those that are around them, and to some degree from that teacher. So I thought this was a quote that touched upon that as well. Questions to ponder. I have 5 questions to ponder I came up with. One, first question is it too late to put the genie, the official theory, back in the bottle? In other words, have we become so prescribed to this notion of learning that it may be hard? And the author focuses actually the last segment on how we go about doing that. But I just worry that it's become such an ingrained part of our educational environment. Uh, can we can we move beyond it? And also, I asked the question is, how does the classic view of learning enable one to become a computer program, an electrician, a logistic manager for UPS, and so on? I know the author touched upon this a bit, but obviously someone who would go into the field of electrician would have to be interested, and that's what he talked about in terms of the classic view. But also in that learning, it's important that there is some memorization of facts. Now, I just wonder if that how do we do that? How do we teach an electrician to be an electrician without having to memorize the facts as we do with the official theory of learning? Um, the next question to ponder: how does one confront the entire industry of official theory of learning? Um, it's a very powerful industry, and when I mean industry, I'm talking from everyone from school administrators all the way up to politicians to textbook writers, um, all of which have invested in the official theory of learning. Um, how do we confront? I know that the author talks a lot about the teacher doing that, but at some point it's going to take individuals within the industry to begin to ask the question of, is this the right approach to learning? Which kind of goes into my next couple questions here. An entire generation or more that came to understand the world via the official theory of learning has put a man on the moon, brought the information age to my fingertips. So those individuals within the industry that I was discussing before with the previous question may ask, well, what's wrong with it again? In other words, having enjoyed the success that we have, particularly in this country over the last 100 years since we've adopted to the official theory, it creates a challenge when the response can be, well, we've been so much successful now. Why change? And part of that is my last question: is that why do parents, teachers, and educators allow for this style of learning, the official theory, to take place day in and day out? In other words, if we know, particularly, myself being a parent of a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I observed them over the years learn and how they learned, and I know that it really supports what the author was stating from the classic view. Why do we accept it? That was a question I thought to ponder. And the last segment, would I recommend this book to someone else in our program? Why or why not? I most definitely would recommend this book to individuals, not just in this program, but even ones that I work with, because for so many years, I'll have to say that I prescribe to the official theory of learning. And I can definitely say this book has given me reason to think about that notion. Thank you.